On the afternoon of the 26th of January, 1904, a heavyset man in a fine coat walked out of a London courtroom having just been sentenced to 7 years in prison. He did not weep and he did not protest. He asked, quietly, for a cigar and stepped into a side room with his solicitors. Minutes later, he was dead, felled by a capsule of cyanide he had carried into the building. In his hip pocket sat a loaded revolver he never had to use. His name was James Whitaker Wright, and for a brief glittering decade, he had been one of the richest financiers in the British Empire. Almost none of it had been real. He was born in Stafford in February 1846, the son of a Methodist minister and a mother whose family name, Whitaker, he would carry like a banner for the rest of his life. He trained briefly as a printer and even preached for a time before illness ended that path. When his father died, the family crossed the Atlantic and settled near Toronto. America was where Whitaker Wright learned his real trade. In the silver camps of Leadville, Colorado, and the diggings of New Mexico, he promoted one mining company after another. He had a gift for it. He could make a hole in the ground sound like a fortune. The trouble was that, by his own later admission, almost none of those companies ever made money for the people who bought the shares. By the 1890s, Wright was back in London, and London was hungry for exactly what he was selling. Gold had been struck in Western Australia, in the parched red country around Kalgoorlie and Coolgardie, and the whole city was gripped by a fever for Australian mining shares. A man who could speak with authority about distant reefs and crushing mills, who carried himself like a magnate and entertained like a prince, could raise enormous sums almost on his word alone. Wright understood that the product he was really selling was not ore. It was confidence. And confidence, properly staged, could be manufactured far more cheaply than gold. His instrument was the London and Globe Finance Corporation, and around it he wove a web of interlocking companies that bought, sold, and promoted mines across the world. The grandest touch of all was the man he placed in the chairman's seat. The Marquis of Dufferin and Ava had been a viceroy of India and an ambassador to half the courts of Europe, a name that opened every door and reassured every nervous investor. He understood diplomacy. He did not understand balance sheets. Wright surrounded himself with titled directors who lent the enterprise the gloss of respectability while leaving the actual figures entirely in his own hands. The machine worked like this. Wright would float a company, talk up its prospects in the financial press, and watch the share price climb. Then his companies would sell shares to one another, passing the same assets back and forth at ever higher prices, each transaction booked as a profit. The profits paid handsome dividends, the dividends drew fresh investors, and the fresh money covered the losses hidden underneath. When the numbers refused to cooperate, Wright simply rewrote them. Balance sheets were dressed up, the value of the mines inflated, and the mounting liabilities quietly left off the page. To the outside world, London and Globe looked like a fountain of wealth. Inside, it was a debt being shoveled from one pocket to another. The fortune Wright showed the world was real enough to touch. He bought a great Surrey estate, renamed it, and reshaped the land itself, carving out artificial lakes across the grounds. Beneath one of them, he built the feature that fascinated the public for generations afterward, a domed glass chamber sunk below the surface of the water, an underwater room where guests could sit and watch fish drift past the windows. He kept a racing yacht that famously beat a yacht owned by the German Kaiser. Every extravagance was a kind of advertisement, proof to the investing public that the money behind Whitaker Wright must be bottomless. The spectacle was the point. Every scheme like this depends on the music never stopping, and in 1900 it stopped. Several of the mines Wright had promoted simply failed to deliver the gold he had promised, and one venture in the Australian goldfields swallowed vast sums in losses. To keep the empire afloat, he reached for an ambitious new project, a London Underground Railway, the line that would become the Bakerloo. He needed the public to subscribe to its bonds. This time, the public hesitated. The fresh money he depended on to paper over the old losses did not arrive. In December 1900, the structure gave way, and London and Globe collapsed, dragging its sister companies down with it. The fall was enormous. Shareholders across the 13 companies were wiped out, with losses later reckoned in the millions of pounds, a sum that would run into the hundreds of millions in today's money. Clerks, widows, and small investors who had trusted the titled directors and the magnificent estate found their savings simply gone. At first, the authorities declined to prosecute, and it seemed Wright might walk away from the wreckage untouched. He did not wait to find out. He boarded a ship and crossed the Atlantic to New York, the city where his career had begun, hoping distance and American soil would keep the law at arm's length. Ruined investors refused to let the matter rest. Where the Crown had hesitated, a private prosecution was mounted, and pressure built until extradition proceedings reached across the ocean. Wright was brought back to England to answer for the books he had falsified. The case opened in January 1904 before Mr. Justice Bigham, a judge later remembered for presiding over the inquiry into the loss of the Titanic. Leading the prosecution was Rufus Isaacs, one of the sharpest advocates of the age and a future Lord Chief Justice. Against such men, the affable certainty that had charmed a generation of shareholders began, at last, to fail him. The evidence was patient and devastating. Line by line, the prosecution showed how assets had been double counted, how losses had been buried, and how dividends had been paid not out of profit but out of capital, the investors' own money handed back to them and called a return. The jury did not take long. Whitaker Wright was convicted of fraud and sentenced to 7 years in prison. For a man who had dined with marquises and outsailed an emperor, it was the end of the only role he had ever truly wanted to play, that of a great and trusted man. He was allowed to retire to a private room with his advisors before being taken away. In that quiet anteroom, away from the eyes of the court, Whitaker Wright took out a capsule of cyanide and swallowed it. He died within minutes on the very premises where he had been condemned. Only afterward did anyone discover the loaded revolver in his pocket, a second means of escape he had carried in case the first one failed. The civil courts had no reason to search a convicted financier for poison, and so he carried his exit straight past them. The man who had spent a decade controlling exactly what the public was allowed to see had arranged, in the end, to control the manner of his own departure. He was buried near his great Surrey estate, the lakes and the underwater room still glittering above the ruin he had left behind. The case left a lasting mark. It hardened the public mood against the celebrity director, the titled name lent to a company by a man who never read its accounts, and it became a textbook lesson in how respectability can be rented to disguise a fraud. The mansion changed hands, the empire dissolved into the records of the bankruptcy courts, and the underwater chamber survived as the strangest monument any swindler ever left. Whitaker Wright sold the world a story of certainty. The only thing he ever truly delivered was the warning it left behind.